Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the rise and fall-ish of neoliberalism, the next in our Cultural History of the United States series. First, I do want to say the last call for the class in France on philosophy and transforming your life with philosophy. That'll be in the Dordogne. If you've ever wanted to visit the beautiful Dordogne, now is your chance. It'll be the 9th, 10th, and 11th of October. And need to sign up in the next couple of days so that we have time to get everything ready for you. I will say that just being in this place and being in a 400-year-old manoir kind of transforms your sense of space and time. If nothing else, it really does have this kind of transformative feeling to it. In any case, all the news, all the information is on my website. I'll put a link below, and let's get to the philosophy. So, I think without question, the single most influential philosophical movement of the 20th century is probably neoliberalism, certainly late 20th century. You could argue communism for early 20th century, certainly hugely influential. However, I think on balance, I would go with neoliberalism because the sheer reach, influence, and impact that neoliberalism has had throughout the world over the last 40 years, 50 years, it's hard to conceptualize. It's so systematic, so pervasive, and so transformative that it's actually hard to see. It's that everywhere. It's that consistent. It's that overwhelming. And you really can't understand neoliberalism, I would argue, without understanding pretty much many of the features that we've discussed so far in this series, because if you take materialism, individualism, and Calvinism and roll it into a ball and mush it up and turn it into a global political and economic philosophy, that's neoliberalism. This is what you get. And it's hard to understand what the hell neoliberalism is about in application if you don't have all of those elements that are really core to the American ideal. And one reason the United States is so important and so influential is because this concept, born in the United States from the cultural background and ideology of the United States, influences everywhere in the world. So it's so pervasive, as we'll see. I'll give you examples of this. So this is why neoliberalism is so important to understand. But I will say rubbishy things about it. But I also want to point out at the beginning that there is little doubt about the impact of neoliberalism, and it's coincided, whether it's causally related, it's coincided with the greatest growth in a reduction in poverty and growth in wealth in world history. Because if you even go back to, say, 1950, 1960, you're looking at a world where roughly, more than half the world's population, say in 1970, you're looking at 3.7 billion roughly people in the world. About 1.8 billion or so are living on less than $1 a day. So that was the definition of extreme poverty. Fast forward to the age of neoliberalism, which certainly impacted a lot of this. You have the Green Revolution in there, sort of opening of markets, all kinds of elements. But neoliberalism was right there at the core. And today, this is the most recent numbers are about 2019 that I could track that looked reasonable and good, because it always takes a little time to calculate that. So you could say 1920, you're looking at a world where less than, let's say 700 million-ish people live in extreme poverty. Now that's been raised to about $2.25 a day, purchase power parity, scoring and stuff. So that's actually probably more than $1 a day, but we'll call that equal. And that's on a population of, pushing 8 billion. So we're talking about maybe 1/10 of the world population or less living in extreme poverty, as opposed to over half. So the transformation that has coincided with and clearly been driven in part by neoliberal concepts have been just massively important in lifting hundreds of millions, indeed billions of people out of extreme poverty. So, whatever else you say about it, at some level you have to say there's aspects of it that have worked really well. Now, having said that, the reason to be concerned about some of this, because one, it is the expression of a particular cultural ideology. from a particular place. And while many of the impacts have been quite positive, over time, many of the elements of neoliberalism that are less savory have become increasingly problematic. So, this is definitely a mixed bag, but always want to keep in mind that it has had this dramatically positive impact on many aspects of the world and in the massive reduction of poverty. So, why do I say this is so influential? Wow. You could just look at the individual people, right? It's the Thatcher Revolution and the Reagan Revolution, both huge in England and the United States, were massively important in bringing neoliberal ideas to the fore. Deng Xiaoping in China, similarly, massively important in bringing neoliberal ideas to the fore. The complete remaking of global trade to come closer, never a perfect instantiation of the core ideas, which we'll review in a second. But these leaders who, just Deng Xiaoping, like a lot of that poverty reduction was because of China, and later because of India, doing similar reforms and taking populations that were 80, 90% living in rural poverty and transforming them to populations that are, 70, 30, something like this. Those sorts of impacts are just dramatic and impact everybody, even people who don't believe in them. So, what is neoliberalism? Well, the core concepts you're probably familiar with, and they seem obvious and simple enough, but that's only because we live in a world where they've been this has been driven home to us, and so we take it as given that this is how the world works. Hello, Calvinist idea. But, okay, what's the main elements here? Free markets, number one, that as much as possible, that we should have reduced trade barriers both within countries and between countries so that goods and services can flow as freely as possible, because that gives the best results for economic growth and individual benefit. That barriers, particularly trade barriers and tariffs, these sorts of things, impede flow, create inefficiencies, and therefore, Canada can grow a lot of wheat, the U.S. can grow a lot of wheat cheaply, and if we export that, then a lot of people can get cheap bread other places in the world. And if you don't allow that, what you're really doing is raising the cost of food in places, and this leads to starvation and et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is, hey, let's lower trade barriers, let the free movement of goods occur, and that will generally help raise everybody's ship. Privatization, this is a big one, that anything that's owned by the state or controlled by the state should be moved to private industry, because by definition, private industry is more efficient than government at delivering goods and services. And so, you shouldn't have public train services, because those aren't going to work very well. What you want are private train services, because those would deliver faster, cheaper, better service to the people. And so all that, public education, that we should get rid of that. All these sort of public government-owned sectors of the economy should be privatized under the idea that private industry and private individuals will do a better job of delivering whatever the good is that sort of system or that product is supposed to be delivering, like, public transportation, public education, healthcare, all of these services. Deregulation, of course, see privatization. The idea is you want to get rid of all the regulation that strangulates the opportunity for free trade to distribute goods and services freely. And the best way to do that is just have the least amount of government regulation that you possibly can. Of course, defining what the least amount is one of those tricky things, but anyway, that's the concept. And so this is the less government intervention, either through ownership or through regulation, that you have, the better your economy is going to function. Globalization, see Article 1 that I just mentioned, which is free trade, that we want to look at the world globally, not as a collection of isolated nation states, each battling for their own good, but rather to create a whole world of freely interacting global entities that can distribute and invest and share profit and transfer money without the barriers that states have traditionally imposed. So one of the reasons you see a lot of rise of nationalism all over the world over the last 20 years is in part because a resistance to and a reaction against the neoliberal push to continually create supranational trade barriers, corporations, legal structures that supersede the local even being at the national level, much less a state or a county kind of level. The notion of individual responsibility, which is, of course, all of this is directed at trying to put the individual in the best position. So again, this is one good way to think of libertarianism is the expression of libertarian ideas that we discussed last time on a geopolitical level, because you want the individuals to make all the decisions, or as many decisions as possible, and the freer the individual, the freer the trade, the more opportunity they have to express themselves, the more efficient everything works. Fiscal austerity, this is a huge one that's very important to understand. And the last one that we'll talk about, there's some other features, but I think these are the most important ones. And this is the notion that governments need to, one, balance their books, spend as little as possible. The idea is that if government is taking money in taxes or borrowing, they're removing money from the economy that could be better spent by private industry, again, back to privatization and deregulation, that if you're taking taxes or you're taking tariffs, or if you're borrowing money, that all could be better used by other entities. So what we want is fiscal austerity, the governments to have as little money as possible and to spend as little money as possible, so that the greater the private part of the economy can grow, be a larger part of the GDP, and this will be more efficient and make the world better for everyone else. Great. So these ideas have been, like I said, if you think of the Thatcher Revolution, the Reagan Revolution, they are expressions of, they aren't the originators of this, but they are expressions of all of these concepts. And what happened is again, the global dominance of the United States as economic superpower, also military superpower, of course, but an economic superpower. When the Soviet Union fell, all the checks were gone, all the counterbalances were lost. But it was clear for more than a decade that economically the Soviet Union was struggling, right? That they were not really providing a viable alternative to what the U.S. was pitching. Not that many people predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was just like, they're not growing as robustly. They're having problems with production. They're not doing a good job of delivering goods and services to their people. So, this other system looks better. And so the sort of more globalist U.S.-centric view of the world was gaining dominance. And again, you had the Thatcher Revolution and the Reagan Revolution in England and the United States at roughly the similar time periods. And so these two kind of leading states, and it's important to remember that England used to be, relative to the world economy, a very large economy. Because of the growth of China and India and Brazil and some of these other countries, it is not the dominant position it was. But if you go back to the Thatcher era, it really was taken as one of the leading, both for historical reasons and for size, that it was one of the leading sort of torchbearers. And so big changes in England meant everybody was paying attention. And so all these ideas are coming to the fore. Freer trade markets are being created. NAFTA in the United States, North American trade agreement, other bilateral trade negotiations are opening up markets. And this concept of globalization and free trade is really spreading. And austerity, by the way, the notion that governments should spend less and balance their budgets, which Clinton actually more or less did, depending on how you do the numbers, but he probably had a budget surplus there for 1 or 2 years, right? All of these ideas are taking over. The Soviet Union falls, and this is when the Calvinism comes in, like this idea that had been already adopted by things like the World Bank is like the national instantiation of this idea. We'll loan money to help out developing countries, but when they borrow it, we're going to have all kinds of demands. You've got to cut government spending. You've got to balance your budgets. You've got to do all of these things that often upset the citizens of the countries. But if the governments were going to participate in a global economy, they had to do certain things to meet all the standards to be able to export, to be able to import. And so often they had little or no choice but to borrow money and take on these sort of austerity budgets that were kind of more or less imposed on them. And so these sorts of tensions start building and building, but the Soviet Union falls. What's the alternative? And so again, that triumphalism, American triumphalism that both looked inward was also projecting out. And that outward projection is the neoliberal world order. So Soviet Union falls. At this point, specialists, and I knew some of these people, were sent all over to the former Soviet states and to Russia itself now to show them how to set up economies based on these principles. They knew the answer. This is the Calvinist element of this. They went into these countries and said, right, here's how you establish the right kind of economy. And I actually have, weirdly, I have a chapter of this in my dissertation. And I pointed out that we were in a bizarre situation then, hence this has changed since then, but at the time, so, we're talking the late 90s, 2000s, the World Bank did not have basically area specialists. They didn't have like a team, so they would go into loan to, say, I don't know, Brazil or Argentina or something, and they did not have a bunch of economists and specialists in Brazilian economic history, socioeconomics, government structure, all this. They just had regional people. And the idea here is like, look, we know what's right. We're going to the Brazilians can figure out how to impose it, but we know what's right. We don't need to know anything about Brazil. That's not what's important. What's important is to understand neoliberal concepts and make sure that these countries are meeting them, regardless of their demographics and histories and governing structures and all of that. It was this, it was just awe-inspiring in the combination of sort of arrogance and naivete with which these ideas were being applied. And so this created just massive social dislocation. Of course, the class of the Soviet Union is not helping, but then you have these heavily welfare state, communist nations, unsurprisingly, have very large welfare states. And then you have neoliberal economists and socioeconomic, specialists coming in. By the way, often they didn't speak the language, they don't know the history. It's this whole classic problem. And they're coming in and saying, however, we have the Bible. We know what you need to do. You just have to figure out how to do it. And if you meet this, and this, if you open up to trade, if you cut your support for your workers, if you eliminate all these pensions you're paying to people, if you, just stop all this, privatize all your industry, then magic happens and positive outcome. Boom. Everybody's happy. That turned out, to have very mixed results, right? So there was not an unmixed outcome of that. But again, similarly, as the EU was expanding, one of the rules for making to join the EU was to meet the kind of neoliberal economic guidelines that were being imposed. You could only have so much budget deficits. You had to meet various, of course, currency restrictions, and you had to open your markets to all kinds of trade, right? And so all of these. And so a lot of the countries that actually joined the EU did so at a very high price of social dislocation. But once again, is if we meet these neoliberal ideals, if we check all the boxes, then magic, great things will happen despite the massive social dislocation that they were undergoing. So lots of social, political, and local pain was experienced. And this reach was so great and so powerful that even leaders who absolutely did not believe in this stuff were forced to relent. And so one of the great examples would be Francois Mitterrand, who was elected, and this is before the total heyday of neoliberalism, but it was already running, it was already taking place. So Mitterrand is elected, I think, 81. I'm going to say 81. 81. Mitterrand is elected. What's important, though, is he was the first socialist government of France since I think before the war, like Blum, I think 38 or something. And he had a massive mandate, big landslide, socialist, communist win. They've got the parliament. They have the support of the people. They know what they want to do. They go in and they say, well, we're going to protect the worker. We're going to reduce hours. We're going to increase pension. We're going to increase wages. We're going to do all this wonderful stuff for everybody. And the franc just had to devalue the franc twice. They could not pull this off because the free trade, global free monetary policies, they tried to link it to the German mark. This did not turn out to be a good idea. And so France was forced to relent from this program, which on paper was roughly the opposite of many of the neoliberal ideas. And one reason there was a big push for the European Union is they're like, wow, like no country can stand up to these market forces, this free trade global financial environment, if you don't have scale. If you don't just have massive economic scale, then you have no chance. Like lots of individual small states just can't make this work. And so what we need to do is form a super state, and that super state will give us the heft we need to have more ability to negotiate and survive within this new neoliberal world financial market. So this is where this comes from. And again, good impacts, bad impacts, but just pervasive. So even if you're a super popular leader of a major European state who has all the support he could ever ask for, you're still feeling this, even if you don't believe in it. And so that kind of total dominance over the last 40, 50 years, now we're going on 50 years, of course, led to the notion that this is just natural, right? Like this is just the way global markets have to be. This is how things work. So as the EU is expanding, now we get to the fall-ish part of the story. As the EU is expanding and these new states are coming in and trying to meet these standards of minimum debt ratios and minimum government spending and borrowing and all of this, in rolls the 2008 financial crisis. And what the 2008 financial crisis demonstrated, like wildly, was, hey, all this free market stuff sometimes leads to catastrophe. And when there's a catastrophe, governments intervene massively to keep the system alive, right? That how do you keep the system going? Oh, well, and particularly the United States government, of course, intervenes. Trillions and trillions of dollars are pumped in. Companies are bailed out. Credit, just an entire panoply of credit services are extended so that businesses and governments can keep things rolling. And the whole thing gets bailed out, or big aspects of it. And so, wow, people took a moment and went, hey, wait a second. Traditionally, though, basically what happened, and this is what started people thinking and led to the questions about the neoliberal order on a mass scale, was banks got bailed out, but not homeowners. Some countries got bailed out in Europe, but some countries didn't. Some banks got saved and some didn't. Some institutions were backed and it had this kind of like, well, hey, why does a bank get $1 billion, $10 billion, $100 billion in bailout, but all these people who lose their job get their unemployment benefits cut because, of course, we've got to have these austerity budgets that roll in because governments don't have money because the economy is collapsing, right? Well, that seems weird that we have massive layoffs, wage cuts, unemployment benefits cuts, and banks just got $50 billion or $100 billion or $1 trillion. And this started to get people just a touch upset because, like, hey, the conflict is clear. When the banks need money, when the major institutional players need bailing out, they get bailed out by the government. So much for no government intervention. But no government intervention for private individuals. Private individuals definitely on their own. Too bad for you. Large institutions not on their own. Oh, okay, well, we'll bail you out. And so, this got people thinking, got people suspicious. And then, of course, the pandemic rolls along not too much later, and any chance at all that the neoliberalism was a functional idea just went out the window because governments intervened massively in every aspect of the global economy, right? I mean, just it's not even worth reviewing, but of course, I think all the way at the just trillions of dollars, shut down factories, close international trade, mess up the entire global distribution system. just boom, out the window. Everything is gone. And so now people are really suspicious of this. Like, hey, wait a second. Like, so much for no government intervention, right? Like, wait a second. So some is good. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's bad. Sometimes individuals are on their own. Sometimes they're not. And so this massive incoherence has been presented. At the same time, particularly in the United States with the election of Trump, but there's been a lot of forces at play in this. And for just a historical note, it's important to remember, slightly obscure, things that don't happen are often hard to remember. But Clinton and the Obama administration, Clinton was running with, and the Obama administration had been working on the huge Pacific Free Trade Agreement, which would have been a massive, again, just the massive expansion of the neoliberal order, because more countries in the Pacific Rim would have been participating in a U.S.-led, of course, free trade zone that would have, reduced barriers, increased direct investment, all the litany of good things that are supposed to come with neoliberal trade associations. But the Trump administration, or Trump when he ran, attacked this and said, hey, this is just shipping more American jobs overseas. This attacks American factories, so on and so forth. And when he won, not only did they not do the Pacific Trade Agreement, but they started putting up tariffs. And the Trump administration was pretty aggressive, particularly against China, in adding tariffs, which of course are trade barriers, and the exact opposite, because they're not supposed to have government intervention. You're supposed to be doing free trade. You're not supposed to control the markets based on national interests. You're supposed to have minimal government intervention. Globalization cannot thrive in an environment where there's lots of tariffs and retroactive tariffs and, tariffs being used as basically weapons of national power. And so Trump put a lot of those in place, and the Biden administration, different in many other ways, came in and was like, we're pretty good with that. And in fact, we're going to throw a few more of those in there. And so the core, like the actual functional core of global free trade is being threatened on a number of fronts, but that's the most obvious one, is that increasingly nations and regions are starting to say, hey, wait a second, like not that much globalization, not that much free trade. And so there has been both at the individual and country level, as I mentioned before, a lot of populism grows out of this, like going, hey, wait a second, Brexit, for instance, like governments we don't have any say over, rules that we didn't get to vote on, trade ideas that we didn't get to influence very directly are having a massive impact on my life, and I can't say anything about it. Why does my government have to meet these targets? Is there anything else we can do? So on and so forth. And so that kind of experience at the personal, regional, national, and global level has started to really undermine the notion that, well, there is just neoliberalism. There's no other choice. This is the right way to do things. The challenge here is that so far, no one has come up with the next great idea. And it turns out that in the history of the world and the history of global ideas, and that something that's not working may fail, but generally it is either attacked from the outside and destroyed, or an alternative is offered. Because if you have a bad engine, it doesn't run well, and that that, you might even go, yeah, this thing is a piece of crap. If you don't have an alternative, you're just like, but I'm going to keep using it because I need to do something. And so far, there has not been a clearly articulated alternative that's been presented that has started to gain global dominance. We're seeing the return of some of these trade barriers. You're seeing some ideas like modern monetary theory, which argues that debt is not an issue. Inflation is what you have to worry about. Some of these ideas are bubbling around. They're starting to come to the fore. But no one has yet been able to crack certain aspects of the neoliberal concept. And so even no matter where you live, basically no matter what you're doing, these core concepts are still influencing you. And just to give you an example of this, so There's been high rates of inflation, so particularly coming out of the pandemic, and so all over the world, central banks, but the most important, ECB, the Fed in the United States, Japanese central bank, Japanese less, by the way, interesting case, but those major central banks raised interest rates. Now, this was specifically to reduce inflation and help the economies of Europe and the United States, and the idea that this will be better for the world. However, if you're in a small developing country or even a large developing country, what you just saw is your cost of borrowing skyrocket. And when your costs of borrowing skyrocket, A, you're probably going to borrow less, and B, banks are going to lend less because they don't think you can pay it back, which is not unreasonable, of course, higher interest rates. And so, direct borrowing by lots of developing countries fell dramatically, which means, let's assume they were going to do good things with that money. Well, those good things aren't going to happen. Hospitals aren't going to get built, road investment, ports, infrastructure, right? Whatever, just is going to slow down. And so while the U.S. economy and the Europe economy may have been overheating, and hence the standard response is to, we've got to reduce inflation, so we'll raise interest rates. This whole monetarist global policy that comes with neoliberalism impacts everybody. But they don't get to vote. No one gets to vote on the Fed, by the way. So this is also one of the interesting elements of it. Like, these technocratic, very, very small handful of people have this dramatic impact on, the price of, cooking oil all over the developing world, because they just said, our inflation's running hot. We'll raise interest rates. So they didn't say, hey, let's jack up the cost of cooking oil in Sri Lanka. They just said, no, this is what's good. This is the rules for the best for the world as we see it. And we're not elected, but we're appointed, and there's 10 of us, so that's a lot of people. And we'll just decide how this goes, and we'll follow the rule book. And there you have it. And so again, people have credit card, their credit card rates go up. People are trying to get a mortgage loan, their mortgage rate loans go up, right? All just all follows. And where does it follow from? It follows from this global perspective on markets, privatization, deregulation, minimal government interference, et cetera, et cetera. But notice, now we'll get to the more of the interesting part. The goal here, though, is what I think is often unarticulated. So the goal is that, this is the best thing for everyone in the world on average to have this sort of free trade globalist interaction. It's like, okay, let's say this is true, define best, right? Like, what do we mean by best? Do we mean fewest people in poverty? Because we've certainly dramatically reduced poverty, very good. We could do a lot more. We could say, okay, every trade deal that we do, every deregulation we do, everything, it's designed to say what pockets of poverty do we have left, and what can we do within the neoliberal context to reduce that poverty. This could be an articulated and clearly stated goal that is worked towards intentionally. This is generally not how this is done. For instance, one of the free trade elements that's supposed to go along with this is the free movement of people, which EU has been struggling with that one, right? This has created untold unhappiness and political dissension throughout the EU, in fact, in many other places of the world, because it turns out that the mass migration of people is disruptive and has been culturally disruptive, historically speaking, and today. And so you're like, wait a second. Do we want to allow the free movement of people? Like maybe not. Like let's talk about this. In fact, this was one of the big drivers of Brexit is the argument that, we can't control the movements of people because we're part of the Schengen zone and the free movement of EU citizens around, and then you have the whole refugee issue and the laws around that. And it's like, hey, where do you come down on that? You can say, no, that's just part of the free movement of everything, and that's great, except for basically this is not allowed anywhere in the world. So like it's definitely controversial everywhere, and people try to limit this and control it, and it's one of the core problems. But if you don't articulate what the good is, so for instance, you say NAFTA in the United States was just a clear example. I talked about this before. It really did reduce trade barriers and generate a lot of business and generate a lot of trade with Mexico at the expense of factory workers in the United States. It was just a clear trade-off. Now you can argue this is a net good, but you can't argue that it didn't have a very dramatic impact on these individuals. And it's like, well, why should they accept paying the pain for a net economic good from which they don't benefit? And and this is what I think is rarely discussed, is they just say, well, this is the stuff that has to happen. It's like, well, come on, but who bears the cost? What is the outcome that we're striving for? What does it look like for the winners and the losers in this global system? And because that's rarely asked or discussed, we just roll along as if, oh, there's no question about this. Everything is groovy. And this, by the way, is classic Calvinist. So, this, again, to go back to what we've been talking about, a materially massively wealthy country with lots and lots of space, lots of opportunity, becomes very rich, and then exports this model that says, oh, individual liberty is the best, and free markets are the best, and minimum government interference is the best. And we know this is the best because if you do that, good things happen. Look at us. Look how rich and powerful we are. By the way, the United States did not grow into being the rich and powerful country necessarily following these tenets. That's one of the curiosities of it. But having become rich and powerful, it kind of looked at itself and said, oh, what are those elements that made us rich and powerful? Freedom, libertarianism, the individualism, all the things we've talked about. And they said, let's export it. Not just let's export it, but let's export it with religious zeal. And this is where I think, why I wanted to talk so strongly about the Calvinist implication of this, is when you send, specialists into a country to redo their banking system because the Soviet Union has fallen and they need to modernize, that's not necessarily a bad idea, because you're like, oh, okay, look, you're not in a communist system anymore. How can we help you integrate with the global economy? However, we did not do that. All kinds of specialists were sent out with the answer. They didn't talk about, okay, where are you today? Where should you be tomorrow? How can we ease this transition? What are the best? No, it was like, look, we have the book. We have the book. The book says right here, this is what needs to happen. And yes, it's going to be painful, but that's okay. Right? The suffering of your people is a sign that you're doing it right. Like this is such a great Calvinist, like it's just so pure that I find sometimes it difficult to articulate, because you're like, wow, God wants you to suffer because you're bad. If you're suffering and you're feeling bad, you're doing it right. If you're enjoying it and it's going well, you're doing it wrong, right? That this is the idea. Like, oh yes, they kept talking about this. Oh yeah, John Major at one point was running, yes, it hurt, but yes, it worked, right? Like I think this was one of his campaign slogans in England. But you're like, wow, this notion of okay, we're all going to suffer together. Oh, we're all going to have pain. And that pain is a sign that you're doing it right. Because if you suffer now for your sins of the past, right, because you've been wrong, now we have to punish you, and now you're going to suffer, and your people are going to suffer. And then because of that, you're going to have access to the right way. And then all good things will flow. And anybody who resists this, must be eliminated in various ways, or dealt with, or fought off, or ridiculed. And so coming up with alternatives now for states has been extraordinarily difficult, because, again, it's just so incredibly pervasive. And again, I'll give you just one example of this is, if governments want to borrow, they borrow on international bond markets. And the international bond markets are basically voting on them, charging them interest based on how well they're matching how well their government debt is. All of these neoliberal elements are basically the scorecard. And so if you're doing a bad job, well, they're going to charge you a lot. If you're doing a quote unquote good job, they're going to charge you less. in theory. In practice, of course, the United States runs massive budget deficits, and nobody cares. It turns out that having the largest military in the world it's a good plan. Also, being the home of global banking is a good plan. So, but are there alternatives to this? Well, there's so many alternatives of this. It's just hard to imagine. But the cost of doing it is not necessarily an economic cost per se. It's to break the vision of the neoliberal order. You would have to start doing things like going, maybe we don't go to an open bond market and have them bid on government debt. Maybe there's other ways we can go about doing that, but that would require, remonetizing bonds that governments borrow. This would probably create regional and specific barriers. It would deglobalize the financial system. And the response to that, one can imagine, is not going to be very friendly. And so now you're in an environment where once all these neoliberal concepts and market forces are in place, there really is a significant cost to pay if you try to not follow them. Not because your idea is bad, but because the vested interests in the neoliberal order are going to absolutely punish you if you try to do something different or even just not play. It's very difficult to just not even play. And so the benefits of globalization, the free flow, the massive increase in productivity and GDP that the world has seen over the last 40 or 50 years, in part through the success, has raised a lot of problems. Right? One could even think of it. One could argue, if you wanted to take the best case argument, saying, this has all been great. But, you could say, but now it's the problems of the success of the system are coming to the fore. If it had failed in year 10, we wouldn't be talking about it. We'd be doing something else. And that's, but in any case, these problems really are becoming increasingly challenging. Like, how do you address the kinds of dissonance that you get between market interventions by governments in some instances and then not, or the desire by governments to provide pensions for their retirees and strong unemployment insurance for their workers and have high wages so people can have quality lives, against globalized financial markets that will punish you for doing a lot of that, and also at the same time will do things like have global investment in local real estate markets. By the way, just to choose one of the problems that's been created by this is people are like, why is real estate so wildly expensive in some places that locals can't even think about buying a house and becomes unlivable and rent becomes impossible? Well, one reason is when you take down all the barriers to ownership and investment and all of this, and you make homes an asset globally, well, now you have someone who's working at a grocery store competing with a hedge fund for a finite resource in their area, if that area is attractive. And it turns out that the hedge fund tends to win that battle. Well, if the government intervenes and says, well, that's it, no more investing, you can only own one home, no more of this intervention from foreign money coming in and buying places, blah, blah, blah. Well, this would really, really have a strong impact in reducing the cost of housing. However, if you have a couple of million or 100 million or 10 million or some million of people who own houses, they may not want to see the value of their capital asset dramatically reduced, right? Cut. However, when the financial collapse and everybody's house price collapsed, the market said, well, that's just the way the markets work, and what can you do about it? And when government said, well, let's not let that happen, banks were like, oh no, this is we don't want the government to set house prices. That's supposed to be free market thing, but we do want to be bailed out because we don't want to be that free market. And so, it's not that there's not things that can be done to address some of these problems. Again, like I just mentioned with the housing problem, it'd be pretty easy for governments to just step in and say, you know what, this is more important for local and regional investment, and we just don't want outside money coming in anymore, so we're going to change the rules, and the outside money is going to go away, and the housing prices are going to collapse, and that'll be great. But yeah, great for whom? Again, not great for foreign investors, not great for people who own 10 houses, not great for people who've bought whole regions of Airbnb systems, not great for people who thought their house was worth $1 million and found out it was worth 200,000. But great for people who want to buy houses, great for people who want to rent houses, and great for people who live locally. The story that neoliberalism is told is that there is only one answer, and that if you get priced out of your local market, you just have to move away. Too bad for you. But that's just the price of living in the right system. And that is really coming under stress. But again, to return to the nature of this, of the nature of the cultural history of the United States and reinforce this, what is part of this and what's really happening is people are being forced to live in or work within and look at the world from an American cultural economic perspective. And a lot of people don't like it. And they don't like it because it's not native to their cultural history. Because this is it's become globalized, so we don't recognize this anymore. And we talk about global financial elites, and what we mean is global financial elites who have adopted a worldview that grew from a particular place and from a particular history, and that is the cultural history of the United States of America, which is, of course, why I wanted to do this series anyway. That influence has influenced, just pervaded the lives of people who don't understand it, don't have insight into it, and it is not native to their soil, to their cultural history. And so they really struggle in responding to this. It's hard for their governments. It's hard for their elected officials. And so you keep getting these technocratic specialists and often educated in the United States who come in to implement these plans or to run them or to advise on them because they really are alien. They really are extraneous and yet absolutely pervasive. And so as I started this saying, it's important to understand the culture of the United States because of its dominant position. And you can look at the military, you can look at the scale of its economy, you can look at all these other issues. But one that I think is too often overlooked is this amazingly powerful global intellectual philosophical outlook that has shaped so many aspects of everybody's life is, again, the outcome of this powerful belief in individual liberty and individualism against the collective, in materiality, and that the drive and goal is to generate wealth, that the wealthier, the bigger the economy, the wealthier the globe, the better off everybody is. And combined with this righteousness and this Calvinistic view that suffering is not bad, suffering may be a sign that you're doing the right thing, and that we do have the right answer because we have the right book, and we know we're doing it right because we're getting richer, that cyclical reinforcement. And from the United States view, this all looks obvious because the U.S. is globally winning this race. And so, yeah, if you're the winner of this race, you think, oh. But if you look at China today in a totalitarian and dictatorial way, Xi is trying to push back against this. It's not going well, by the way. In the EU, increasing numbers of countries are trying to start to push back against this. They haven't figured out how to do this. England briefly tried to pass a budget that would have violated many of the tenets of neoliberalism. And boy, that didn't go well at all. And so, the power is still there, the impact is still there, the influence is still there, but the questions are growing. And so part of the dissonance and confusion and sort of political unrest that you see, particularly in the developed and established world, is growing in part from the frisson, from the increasing gap between the neoliberal claims and its pervasiveness and its failings, increasingly obvious failings, and the goals and drives and desires of people who don't recognize it, don't believe in it, and don't understand what it is or why it has to influence their lives this way. And so we live at an interesting time. We live at a time when the death of communism impacted people, because even if they didn't like it, they just thought, well, that's the way economies work, right, within that sphere. And it was shocking for them to discover there's a different way. I think it's something similar may be happening with the neoliberal order, not that it's going to collapse necessarily in that sense of the Soviet Union collapsing, but in that it's under pressure. And it's very likely, I would think, that new things, new ways of looking at this are coming. Now, what they are, again, I have no idea. Hard to predict the future. But it does seem to be that the pervasiveness of the questions are just building and building. And so the cultural unrest, political ferment, the intellectual dissonance that I think many people feel around these issues is growing from the one true gospel is starting to look a little frayed. Somewhere perhaps today, an economic Luther is nailing some theses to the door of a bank, and for some years we might go, oh, that was the moment that the new Reformation started, or this was the time that this alternative force started to grow and really impact the global outlook. So when you think about the United States, and when you think about its influence, you just cannot emphasize enough the impact of this concept of neoliberalism and how it continues to shape the global economy and hence impact the lives of essentially almost everyone on the planet for good and ill, but very often in an unexamined way. And so that, I think, has been the problem, is that it's not understood, not discussed, and rarely pointed out as the powerful impact that it has had and its origins within a very specific culture, that of the United States. So thank you very much, and thank you for your questions. Keep them coming. I'm really enjoying those. And if you're interested, last call to sign up for a transformative course in the beautiful Dordogne. Thank you very much.